Yes, the character is Will Jonas. You mentioned him, I think, in a memoir, and you talk about his Hunters in the Snow poem. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about. I mentioned it previously about
Although
how
I
you
call him a
infuse.
different name, you have to remember I use different names. So
Yeah,
if you go around through all of my novels, you might find the same. You might find four or five differently named characters based on just one person.
yes. But I wanted to mention the fact that you infuse your current self with your past self in here. There's one time where you're talking about plays and some of the uh, flaws of the modern masters in playwriting. The fact that they are always dealing with melodrama rather than pure drama and conversation.
Mhm.
And then you talk about your first play, you catch yourself and go from there. But you also talk about Will's poem "Hunters in the Snow," and I remember in the True Life memoir, you saying that was probably the best poem you've read of that particular penny. But in this one, it's you contradict. You contain multitudes and say that it's actually lesser than other attempts that you've seen it. I don't know if you've reread it and just thought it lesser or not. But talk a little bit about that aspect. Something I
I
caught.
don't remember what I wrote, but again, that's a 15-year difference between 2004 when I wrote.
And did you reread this poem before writing this play?
No, no,
Okay.
I really don't do that. One of the things I try not to do is to if I'm reusing a character, like I didn't reread uh, the uh, the play Theodore when I was doing the Annabelle Duggan character, because time passes and perspectives change, and it's interesting to go back. Just like if I'm writing a character in different times, the Bit von Rheingold from Bit of Golem is different than the Bit von Rheingold in A Norwegian in the Family, and rightfully so. There, it's for a different reason. It's because the character is younger, and it's being told by a different narrator. It's an omniscient narrator in Bit of Golem, and it's Manny Cole in the New York Quartet. But here, no, I didn't reread it. The only thing I reread was some online stuff about the real Emma Wardell uh, that had made news a few years ago.
Yes, talk about that. That's interesting. You actually see her in a prison. It's very much like the TV show The Prisoner, where you're talking to her,
Yeah,
um, and particularly with the penultimate episode where number two and number six go at it. But she takes and steals these Trump signs
mm,
and then explains herself and rationalizes her reason for it and says that the abuse that she's taken by men made her do it.
yeah,
She comes off very privileged and entitled.
right,
Um, so speak about that aspect. This also seems to contradict who she was in the past. You
right.
tell her too that as a poet, you said you take risks. You're an idea man. As soon as you get the technical knowledge, quote unquote, watch out. But with her, she doesn't really take risks in her poems.
No.
It's very mundane stuff. Maybe some horses are galloping in the poem, but they don't really have much depth to them. And Will seems the same. He can render the hunters in the snow well, but he doesn't use that as a jumping off point from the painting.
Well,
Um,
yeah, both the Will character and the Emma character. Uh, well, let me just say, and I mentioned this in the play. About 15 years afterward, in 2002 or '03, I think right before I moved to Texas, I tried looking her and him up, and I emailed both of them. Will never responded to me, the real Will, and the real Emma responded to me, but claimed to not remember me. Now, I even say in the play, people might say, "Well, Dan, that's just your ego thinking you were as important to her as she was to you," just like with the Carissa Drake character. But then she denied knowing the Jonases, which told me, okay, something here is off if she's pretending that she doesn't know who she spent the whole summer with. And I never knew whether the Will character and the Emma character were ever romantically or sexually involved or whatnot. But yeah, both of them ended up working for what we would call green companies. The Emma character became a PR person for assorted green things in New England. The Will Jonas character ended up working for some environmental group out in the Pacific Northwest, and both of them have lived, I guess you would call, average staid lives. Both of them apparently must have married because both of them have kids. The Emma character then, a few years ago during the last election, ended up stealing these Trump signs and claimed that she had been triggered by Donald Trump's mere presence. And I don't know in real life whatever happened to the court case. I assume she probably had to pay a fine or whatnot, or settled out of court or something. But I talk about this because the odd thing was when I came upon this a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and you were on the e-list, and I think I had sent out an email with a link to the real person. I was like, this was one of the more sane females that I was attracted to, and it's like, comparing her to someone like the Penny Farber character from the play we just talked about, or some of the other whack jobs, and she went totally bonkers. It seems totally lost her mind. It's like, what kind of a person? But it gets back to what you had said about. I had this impression that she was like, someone like from the 1930s, someone who was. If there was the book publisher New Direction, she was one of these New Directions kind of people from the 40s and 50s. She was one of these hippie types from the 60s or 70s. But it turned out, in trying to find out more about her, this was a few years ago when she had gotten arrested. Well, apparently her grandfather was a famous Hollywood musical. He scored a lot of the Hollywood films from the 30s and 40s. Her father was like a famous, well-respected professor out on the West Coast. They summered, and when you summer somewhere, as a verb, when you summer, you've got wealth. You're part of the 1%. They summered in northern Italy, Lake Como near Switzerland in the Alps, and then they would take boats back to the States, and so she was rebelling obviously against that, bringing up in some way. And I don't know the ins and outs of it, but it was just so very odd because she did this just wackadoodle thing that is going to haunt her the rest of her life. Now, apparently, in real life, she started her own company because maybe she couldn't get hired after this thing. It wasn't a felony; it would have been just a civil penalty. The criminal charges, I think, were dropped from what I read. But the whole thing was just so wackadoodle that she would do such a thing. But it made her more interesting, I think, in the tone of the play.